How are cities driving action to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030? Our next panel, Global Goals and Global Cities, is presented by FT Moral Money. Please welcome Moderator Leyla Boulton, Executive Editor and Editor of Special Reports, Financial Times, Ijjasz-Vasquez from the World Bank, Penny Abeywardena from New York City's Mayor's Office for International Affairs, Mayor of Quito, Mauricio Rodas, and from UL Environment, Catherine Sheehy.
Hello. 20 years ago, I went to Kyoto, this beautiful Japanese city, to cover the Kyoto Protocol negotiations, which led to the world's first binding effort to curb greenhouse gas emissions. And at the time, it was not only a job to persuade FT readers that this was a really important subject, it was even a bit of a job to convince my news editor at the time to send me halfway across the world to cover this 2-week-long negotiation. So it gives me enormous pleasure, 20 years on, to be hosting a panel on how cities are actually taking action to tackle a problem which 20 years ago was very theoretical to most people and didn't actually involve business, let alone governments, to do very much. And not only are we now at this time really grappling with the kinds of problems that are formally set out in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but the FT has also decided to take this area to an even more serious level by launching a whole new hub called Moral Money, which aims to gather together all the coverage of how business is trying to grapple with corporate social responsibility, impact investing, and ultimately implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. So without further ado, I'd like to get our panelists to explore the practical steps that are needed to implement these important policies in areas including not just climate change, but gender diversity, and so on and so forth. The UN reckons it will cost about $3 trillion a year extra to make progress in implementing the SDGs by 2030. So I think the first port of call is to ask Edie, what kind of access to finance do cities have to achieve these goals?
Absolutely, Leyla, thank you. And thank you for the organizers to inviting us from the World Bank. Look, when we talk SDGs and these big numbers come, $3 trillion, then they look so big that everybody says it's impossible to achieve them. But part of our argument in the World Bank is to say, look, we are only able to achieve the SDGs if everybody in society contributes and provides platforms for financing into this process. It cannot be just the national government. It has to be also the local government, and enlightened mayors and administrations come and say, the SDGs is a practical platform to do what we need to do, all the way from gender empowerment to health to education, etc. So we began a question that is very common, which is, we need to access the private financing. So we went around and we looked at the 500 largest cities in the developing world. How many of them have access to local financing markets? And we found that less than 20% have actually access to local financing markets for a variety of reasons. National regulations don't let them. The local banks don't trust them. They don't have even the financial books to be able to do any of that. And then we check how many have access to the international financing markets. 4%. So talking about the importance of bringing the private sector to finance is critical, but Cities need the support of national governments to be able to give transparent rules of engagement. How do they have the financial books? How do they get the revenues, the taxes? How are they able to have the capacity to do that kind of investments? They rarely have the capacity to do PPPs at the local level, and we'll hear from Mauricio a little bit of those innovations. But at the end, another important topic that we raise, it is that the financial viability of cities depends on a social contract that they build with their citizens. Unless the citizens trust that the fees and the taxes they're paying are going to be used in a transparent, accountable way, that they report back to the citizens what is it that they're doing, nobody's going to be paying taxes, nobody's going to be allowing the taxes to be raised. And I come back to an original point. Everybody needs to figure out, the national government, the local government, citizens, the private sector, the investors, how we're going to be able to achieve the SDGs, how to put the resources for that.
Well, since you mentioned Mauricio, maybe, Mauricio, you can give us your experience of how you recruited the finance to implement the SDGs.
Well, thank you so much to the Chicago Council for the invitation. We have used the SDGs as a transversal axis to everything we did during our time governing Quito. And a clear example of that is our largest infrastructure project in the history of the city, the metro, which we began building in 2016. Now it's in the trials phase. We're really happy about that. And we were very innovative in the way we financed that project. We have 4 multilateral banks financing the project simultaneously, the World Bank, to which we are very grateful, the European Investment Bank, the Inter-American Developing Bank, and the Latin American Developing Bank. But what was so innovative was not only the fact that we have 4 multilateral institutions working together in financing the project, but also they were very closely supervising the project, overseeing it every step of the way, which in a way made it very strict, something that I think is great. And that's why actually we achieved to build the project meeting the schedule and meeting the budget, something that it's not very common for metro projects. And I think it was because of that, because you had very strict regulations on part of the multilateral banks. And the third very important innovation was that the project was ruled not by national legislation, but rather by the bank's policies, international policies. That, of course, was very important in terms of effectiveness, in terms of transparency, and at the end of the day, in terms of result. Once again, we have met the schedule, the budget. We built the metro, with the latest technology. And it is a project obviously very closely related to the SDGs. Why we decided to build the metro? Because we measured our emissions footprint, and 56% of our CO2 emissions came from our mobility system. So that's where we have to focus our efforts on, and that's why we decided to build the metro, which for some big cities in the world might not seem very surprising, but for us, it's really big. This is the first metro in Quito and the first metro in Ecuador, and we're very proud of the fact that in a few months it will start operating and serving the Quito citizens.
So the largesse of multilateral institutions is one thing, but what about scope for involving the private sector in such projects? Does Quito have the capacity and the interest in pursuing that avenue?
We developed some public-private partnerships, particularly in the field of public transportation, through a model that is very common worldwide, the construction of bus stops through the purchasing of, or the commercialization of advertisement on part of the private sector. But I must say that Ecuador and many other countries in the world face a very big obstacle to develop public-private partnerships, and that's because our regulatory frameworks for PPPs are extremely confusing and complex to implement. So I need that a pending task is to revise those regulatory frameworks and improve them. And for that, I think benchmarks and success story sharing is key.
But if I may jump, one of the really interesting lessons of Quito was that when they began thinking about the metro and they came to us, was one of the few cities that when they came to the World Bank for financing, they were not only interested in the projects, they were already working on how to do, thinking about transit-oriented development around the stations, how to make sure that the feeder of the entire transportation system will come to the metro. How, and Mauricio was just telling me just backstage, how they're beginning to sell the rights of development around the stations in ways that we have seen very few cities around the world. So public-private partnerships, not only just for the financing of the project, but it's the development of the public infrastructure to have private investment in a completely different way that is more sustainable. We really like that very much.
Excellent. But Penny, in New York, presumably, we know the World Bank is not going to come and build infrastructure in New York. So,
we learn from them.
but what's the big challenge for you as a city? Is it actually regulation? Because you might say that with New York's current policies on SDGs, you might have more in common with the Norwegian pension fund than you do with the White House. So what is it that you need to get progress done and if business is going to play ball?
So I think we have a lot in common with many entities versus the White House currently. We actually, so back in 2015, which is the year that the global community came together around the Sustainable Development Goals, we launched our One NYC, which is our development agenda, really looking at sustainability and resiliency over the next 20 years, but with a strong equity lens. So what we did with that was we mapped what our targets were within One NYC, whether it was on gender equity, transportation, waste management, to the Sustainable Development Goals. And because of those synergies, we created a platform called Global Vision Urban Action. This is, I think, what we have been trying to lead in New York City is a call to action. The private sector is an important partner, civil society is an important partner, but increasingly cities have become more of a player on the international field, and it's not just because. It's because we need to do that to be able to create opportunities to exchange best practices and figure out partnerships and collaboration, whether it's New York City and Quito, whether it's New York City and Nairobi, and so that is one of the frameworks in which we have done it. Part of the way that we have been building and sort of innovating within this platform is through the voluntary local review, which we had been talking about. The national governments that have all agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals come together every summer during the high-level political forum, where they're encouraged to submit voluntary national reviews in terms of sharing where they're at in terms of the different SDGs. Last summer, New York City, recognizing that our national government was unlikely to do that, proposed the concept to the UN around doing one around a voluntary local review. So we became the first city to formally report into the United Nations as to where we were on the SDGs. And so we have in the last 10 months really created a movement really asking cities like Quito and Helsinki to join us, because as we think about the work that we're doing around the SDGs, we need to have a common language and framework, and that's what the SDGs really allow us to do. You know, your question in part was, you know, you might have more synergies with the Norwegian pension funds. You know, there is truth to that, and what we need to do is create these different platforms for us to share these best practices.
And turning to you, Catherine, what is it that business needs? Presumably, it's very confusing if New York has, you know, one standard of emissions for cars and California has a different framework. What is it that businesses need to actually make real progress across the country and across the markets they operate in?
Sure. And thank you, too, for having us here. We're pleased to be part of this conversation. You know, I'd like to start actually just thinking back to the beginning of this event. Thomas Pritzker talked about cities being the engines of future growth. And if we get this right, we'll create an environment of security for future generations. And that reminded me of something I read about cities, which obviously are places, physical places, with responsibility for infrastructure. they're also governance and have scope of control, span of control, which is increasing as these sort of things kind of come down to the city community level for implementation. But at the heart of it all are people. And cities exist and are endeavoring to achieve the sustainable development goals in part because we all know that the people who live in these cities are the creative spark that make these places that we want to live. And so related to that, companies are like cities in that respect and have some of the same sort of imperatives that are compelling them to look at the Sustainable Development Goals. And so already they're actually doing things to contribute to the SDGs.
What do you think they need to do more?
Yeah.
Because I think that this is a pretty, fragmented landscape. One day you've got one hotel chain announcing that they're phasing out straws from all their hotels, and then, we've got in our hotel just around the corner, we've got plastic bottles all over the place. What is coming from Europe, where there is a European standard for all EU members, and potentially even the ones who might be leaving.
What do they need?
Yeah, what do they need?
And
your clients, what would help them?
it reminds me of the early days of sustainability where there's sort of a lot of variation. So we're in similar places today. So sustainability is becoming sort of like a baseline requirement for doing business. In that context, we've seen it with the evolution of safety over 125 years. Companies are looking for a level playing field. Yeah. They're looking for the ground upon which they all stand, and then they can innovate and differentiate. So for example, just last month, a number of the largest oil and gas companies collaborating with the nonprofit organizations, with consumer packaged good companies, are calling for carbon tax in this country, right? So that's one example, looking at carbon emissions for which we've actually got agreed upon standards for how to measure that. Companies are looking for governments to basically create that consistent framework of measurement by which we all operate so that we can continue to improve. Another example of that is in terms of waste. We have a huge waste diversion program, work with a lot of companies. And just in the United States alone, municipality to municipality, we've got different infrastructure, different requirements. And so companies that are trying to reduce their own waste in light of commitments to zero waste, incorporate recycled content. Same with cities who are making these broad commitments. They're struggling with inconsistencies across those regimes and infrastructure limitations that basically are inhibiting us from achieving some of these grand visions.
Penny, do you want to jump in?
I mean, everybody needs to do more. And again, the SDGs provide us a framework for us to share what we're doing. But cities are starting to do more, and I will say in New York City, we just banned single-use plastics in New York in city government. Mm-hmm. And this, you give the example of Europe, but in the US, there's so much that we need to do. I mean, when you think about parental leave, in 2016, we signed parental leave for 12 weeks, which made us the most generous in the country, along with 2 other cities. I mean, there is just no leadership at our national government level on gender equity or climate, and you are seeing cities really start to push the boundary on that. And New York City did that, the plastics ban a couple of weeks ago, and the UN headquarters just announced their plastic ban. So you really need the private sector, cities, and other institutions doing it together.
So maybe if we ask Edie, if national governments in some situations, some jurisdictions, are not stepping up to the plate, what kind of, do you see investors, private sector investors, multilaterals, pushing for change and a common set of rules?
Well, actually, when national governments sometimes don't move, what we begin to see is that mayors and local administrations begin to move faster just because the mayor is an aggregator of development issues. You have the national government, the president or prime minister, you may have the governor, and you may have the mayor. Everybody else works sectorially. It's the Ministry of Transport, it's the Ministry of Energy, and all that. But the mayor has an additional urgency, which is they live in the same place as their constituencies, as the people who elected them.
Right.
Therefore, they knock on your door all the time, and they have to say, that creates a lot of action into this process. As multilaterals and the private sector, something that we began to do actually almost 10 years ago was to start to asking the question, look, if we need to raise funds and there are investors that are interested on certain dimensions of impact, and we began with the issuance of green bonds 10 years ago, we began to say, look, we have a series of global investments around the world that are so-called green. But then we stop, it's like, what does it mean green? And that's what we're going to say is, how do we define a green investment? How do we define green bond? How do we make sure that we're monitoring those investments to make sure that what is the definition of green is actually being achieved? And how do we have independent auditing to say, yes, makes sense, and how do we report out? So we began to learn that in order to be effective in the green bond market, and now we have issued actually billions of dollars of green bonds, is that issue of a clear definition of independent assessment, of reporting that the public and the investors trust into this process. And now we have begun into exploring blue bonds. How do you actually figure out ways into the blue economy comes into this process, and SDG bonds into this process. So that's part of the exploring of figuring out how do we mobilize investors that are interested in certain dimensions with global action at the local level.
Yeah.
So, and that's one of the goals of Moral Money, is to group together all the excellent coverage we have from different parts of the FT operation, and also to foster a discussion on how to develop the tools, the metrics, and the policy incentives to help business achieve these goals. And we'll also, of course, be keeping a keen eye out for greenwash. We'll be calling that out as well. So in terms of measurement, then, what is it that we can look to for developing a set of metrics that would enable you to compare the effectiveness of $1 spent by a philanthropist in place X and $1 spent by investor in place Y, and a city investment in place C? Can anyone, maybe Edie, you can give us some insight on where we are in terms of developing such metrics? Is it possible?
Look, I think that we're far away from that process. I think that we are beginning to see special segments that are trying to put into this process. I think that our private sector around the IFC has begun to develop a series of standards. It began with the Equator principles to try to do green investment for private investors, and then moving what are the rules of the game for green bonds. We begin to see also many of the initiatives at the city level, for example, on monitoring, on climate and emissions and the like. We're beginning with all multilaterals to have standards on how do we account for the portion of our financing that is related to climate benefits into this process. So we're beginning to see segments of the different actors to try to push to more consistency. Where I think that the SDGs provide us a little bit of a framework to try to start connecting and providing the hooks for a more integrated set of processes, but we are not there yet. I think that we need much more work to be done.
You know, something we are challenged with when we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals is that there's a communications and marketing gap as well. You know, this UN General Assembly in September will have a high-level summit doing a review with the heads of state on the SDGs. It's 4 years old. We have a very urgent timeline for the 2030 goals. But at the end of the day, as we are doing this work around voluntary local reviews and trying to galvanize cities around the world and around the US to work together using this framework, we also need to talk to our communities about it, right? At the end of the day, the SDGs aren't just policies at city level or, you know, behavior of the private sector. It also is the way that our citizens interact with their surroundings, their neighbors, their life, and how are we building that bridge. And so to the question you asked around metrics, we're a long way from that, but we're also a little bit a long way from getting our communities talking about this. And so we have a program called the New York City Junior Ambassadors, and this is where we ask educators to integrate the SDGs into their curriculum. With the winning classrooms, get a whole series of activities through my agency. But at the end of the day, we have 12 to 13-year-olds throughout our 5 boroughs who are doing things around SDGs in their community. They learn about the global impact of it. So SDG 14, life underwater, sounds pretty darn boring to most people, especially a 12-year-old. Well, when they understand what that means in terms of plastics in our ocean, but also what that means in terms of the South Bronx River, which they walk by every day, which is one of our filthiest waterways, we have junior ambassadors that are committed to cleaning up the South Bronx River, and they understand themselves as SDG 14 advocates. We need that kind of pressure for us to feel it at the city level, and I think for the private sector to also feel, because they're their consumers as well. So there's just a lot that needs to be done from the World Bank, the cities, the private sector in that.
But if we wait for the replication of what New York is doing around the world, including countries which are poorer, and say, oh well, you need to go first before we do anything. Maybe Mauricio, you can tell us a little bit about what is the feeling in a less developed country, less prosperous country.
It's a process that it's going forward in some places faster than others. But it's a process that we all should keep pushing for. I want to go back to the point of measurement, because what we try to do is to demonstrate the effect of everything we were doing in terms of SDG fulfillment. So, for example, talking again about the metro project, we were very clear with the population in saying that by building the metro, by operating the metro, and the whole reorganization of the mobility system that would imply, we will be captivating 150,000 tons of CO2 per year. So that was a clear demonstration of the positive effect that this big infrastructure project would be giving the city in terms of the SDGs or the climate change agenda. I also want to go back to what something Edie mentioned before, because we also use the SDGs as a framework for long-term urban planning. And a clear example of that is the incentives we set to grow taller in the buildings around the metro stations. So as long as you meet certain eco-efficiency criteria, saving water, saving energy, providing with public spaces for the general public, you can buy air rights around the metro station. So it gives a whole logic to everything we were doing.
Right.
And of course, promoting the use of public transportation, but also densifying the city instead of keep expanding the urban sprawl.
But if I may say also, I think that the beauty of the SDG framework is the equity dimension that they bring to the conversation. And that's why we see mayors so excited about this. Because it's not the global agenda on climate and all that, but it's very real things of how to empower women and girls, how to make sure that everybody has access to health. And therefore, it throws back the question at then how to serve the excluded populations.
Yes.
How to make sure that those who live in low-income communities or in slums around the world, how do you access them? And therefore, a Quito metro may sound like a fancy infrastructure, but in reality, it's how does the city think for every household, what is the time that reduces going from house to jobs and faster, and the implications that it has for not only household empowerment, but family life, all that process. And I think that equity dimension of the SDGs is something that mayors pick up very quickly and say, this is a nice framework that allows us not only to do what we need to do for our citizens, but also allows us to connect globally and say, we have a global responsibility for local action.
That's exactly.
Thank you. I see now that we need to open the floor up to the audience, which will have, I'm sure, lots of great questions for us to continue and develop the points that our wonderful panelists have made so far. Are there any questions? If so, please raise your hand and we'll bring you a mic.
While we're waiting, can I make a comment on the voluntary local review? Because one of the comments that I get is, of course, New York City should do it because we're a big city, we're host to the UN. At the end of the day, every city mayor or every local authority, if they are responsible, are doing things related to the issues that we have heard about to improve the lives of their citizens. And that work gets captured within an SDG. What we're asking them is to now think, not add more work, but to add a different strategic element of thinking about it through the framework of the SDG and participating in this voluntary local review exercise. What we have done in New York City, and again, this is 10 months old, is that the way that we are reporting into the UN, the barrier for entry is very low. Right. The one thing that is very important to note is that the UN doesn't require national governments to report in using a similar data set or metrics, right? So you can share what you're already doing, and ideally as a mayor, reporting back to your community and the transparency of that. And again, this is an opportunity to not only be a part of a global movement, but be able to share best practices and say, this is what's not working. Maybe you have a great idea. Can we figure out how to replicate that? Can we figure out how did you figure out your financing for that? But let that become a platform. So just to build off Edie's point about equity, we're already doing that work. Yeah. So let's.
I think just to add on to that, the SDGs are wonderful in that it's that systems thinking, comprehensive sort of full spectrum sustainability across equity, environmental issues, labor, human rights issues, right? And so the fact that it's bringing it all together is fantastic, and it's not new. There are measurement tools that are in place and that are being adopted in specific domains of this whole spectrum. You know, built environment has green building requirements that are very well known and adopted, and companies are providing product that feed into that, that contribute to that goal. There are metrics around some of the equity indicators. Pulling that all together in a way to kind of show that progress, the status today and the progress going forward, I think there's a lot of work going on, but certainly in specific domains, as you say, I think that there already are well adopted protocols.
Maybe we don't need any more metrics, therefore. I mean, business has got about 70, I think, to choose from. So, but maybe the more immediate challenge then, once business kind of gets its act together separately, perhaps, is what you mentioned, Penny, and that's the marketing of this. Is this a message that can win elections at national level? I don't know, maybe.
I'd like to believe so.
Now, the other thing that it gives is a sense of urgency, because 2030 is just really around the corner. Right. So we don't agonize too much about measurement, but we try to figure out how to support national, subnational governments moving faster into this process. If the 2030 agenda is going to be achieved, imagine it's full access to health, full access to education, full access to that process. The other angle that we have begun to take in the World Bank is also how to link some of the SDGs to productivity and economic growth. Because at the end, Minister of Finance is saying, yeah, health and education important, but what we're beginning to have is indices that start saying, look, we look at your country and you may be actually having many years of schooling, but the children are not learning. What is the probability of the survival into this process? What is the issue of early childhood education? And through science-based numbers to be able to show what is the loss of productivity that issues such as stunting or early deaths or crime and violence are having on your economic productivity. And that's when Minister of Finance says, okay, let's talk about this. Now you can see what's the linkage of this SDG thing, UN global thing, with the reality of the jobs for the future.
Yeah, and I also think this is something that we discussed yesterday as well. Talking about the communication side of the SDGs, I think that we must convince mayors, national governments, that meeting the SDGs could actually be politically sexy. Yeah. That's really important. Because at the end of the day, however you phrase it, it's about improving people's lives in a comprehensive and holistic way. That's the beauty of the SDGs.
Excellent. I return to our dear audience. Still no questions? Our panelists have explained everything beautifully to us.
I'd be curious if you, so you asked what do companies need. I'd be interested in hearing what do cities need from companies or organizations such as ours who are bringing, helping our customers bring better products, services, solutions to the market.
Yeah. I mean, partnership. New York City, a good number of the policies that we implement are in partnership with different companies. I mean, this is a small one, but a really powerful one. When we think about climate change, banning plastics, at the end of the day, there's also consumer behavior that is at that foundation. Our mayor's office for sustainability, run by Mark Chambers, navigated a wonderful partnership with Swell, where they donated Swell metallic water bottles to all New York City high school students. And that is such an important, there are plastic bottles everywhere, and we now need to see a plastic bottle and react a certain way to it. And we need to start with young people, and what does that look like? But I think it's definitely partnerships that we need, but we also need to see leadership. The Mayor Bill de Blasio, launched our Green New Deal a couple of weeks ago. It's our second iteration of One NYC. We're in our second term. And we really focused on what does it look like to have all large buildings in New York City, existing buildings, reduce their emissions. This is the first, I think, globally that cities have required this through an executive order. But we need those companies to support us in this and help achieve that and do it with a sense of urgency. So that's my...
And I think that we completed a study of competitive cities around the developing world, because we're trying to understand why some cities are more competitive than their national averages, why they survive all the constraints that national government may impose on them. And we began to realize is what you said, is partnerships. When the mayor comes and says, we need this alliance with the private sector for two reasons. First, of innovation. We have certain big issues in the city. How do you help us bring the best innovative solutions together? And second, what are the constraints that the private sector has?
Yeah.
So the government, when it's sitting in its municipal building, has all these ideas of what the private sector needs. Unless you sit down and ask the private sector, what is blocking you from this, so that you can live what they may think is priorities 1, 2, 3, the reality is that they need 7, 8, and 9. And that's what unleashes a lot of the innovation, but also combine action into this process. And move away from that thinking that is either the corporate and social responsibility the divisions of the private sector that is going to save the world. No, it's how do you actually find jobs and growth in a way that is sustainable for the city in very practical ways. That partnership and dialogue makes all the difference and is in all regions of the world. Okay, so we studied from Rwanda to Kenya to Turkey and Colombia. That commonality was something that we saw that makes a city far more competitive.
Wonderful. Now, just very, very quickly, what is your one piece of advice to investors who want to do more?
I would say providing with ideas, having the initiative to actually approach cities, municipalities, to develop projects together. I think that some corporations do, but a very few of them. And I think there's a huge potential for a greater cooperation between the public and the private sector when it comes to SDGs at the city level.
Thank you very much. And so I would like to thank our wonderful panelists for shedding a lot of light on a really important topic in a very short space of time. Thank you.